How do you promote a podcast when you're in between seasons? How are some ways that you can increase your listener engagement, increase your downloads, and still be relevant online? Well, I got this question enough times from my audience that I thought this is definitely such a meta way to end season 3 of the podcast space and tell you all the ways that you can leverage social media, newsletters, and even Google to grow your podcast listenership, to increase your downloads, and still be relevant in between shows. I'm going to be sharing with you ways that are a little more work, and some they are like a no-brainer way to grow your downloads, because let's be honest, there's so many different ways to grow a show. And so I want to offer you some options when you're looking at marketing a podcast in between seasons. So if we haven't met, hi, I'm Nick Xavier. I'm the founder of the podcast space. I'm an award-winning podcast marketer, and I teach you how to leverage your podcast to grow your downloads, grow your visibility, increase your downloads, and of course, get to your business goals. So let's dive right into the last episode of season 3 of the podcast space. I want to start by telling you why you need to promote your podcast in between seasons. Of course, if you're someone who says, Anna, I have absolutely no way to grow and promote the podcast in between seasons because I'm just overwhelmed, well then, take a pause, don't listen to this episode, listen to something else. But if you are in that situation and you want to grow your brand while in between seasons, I want to remind you that people need multiple touch points in order to consume content. Also, your audience keeps growing. It's important to let previous listeners know how they can consume content that you absolutely know that they need to consume. And also, let's be honest, when was the last time that you were able to tell a friend about all the elements of that podcast episode that you listened maybe like a month ago? You're likely probably forgot about half of what that episode was. So you're actually doing a favor by reminding listeners of that content. And so I want to remind you that podcast content is one of the best and most efficient ways to build trust with listeners, potential buyers, and even sponsors. So remaining relevant, staying on the timeline, whatever it is, and continuing to grow your podcast in between seasons, not just saying, you know what, like whatever, I'm like completely ditching the show. You don't have to. There's so many different ways that you can use creatively your time to market older episodes. And so I want to talk about a little bit how we can do that via social media, newsletters, and even Google. And before we get into some of the misconceptions, I want to remind you that you always have to go back to this. What's the point of marketing the podcast? Are you looking to grow listeners? Are you looking to feed your online ecosystem online so people don't forget about you? Increasing the sales, building up momentum toward a product launch, or give you time to grow an audience. So those are things that I want you to think about before you just go on and start marketing the podcast. Now, common questions that I get, and some of these are misconceptions. So this is a big one. If you stop releasing content, you'll lose your listeners forever, and then you won't be able to catch them. And so this is partly true because podcasts fill holes in people's routines. So what I mean is, like, it's not that people go, oh, I want to listen to these podcasts and then I happen to be driving. No, they're driving, and therefore how long the drive is, they're going to be looking for a podcast that either fits the vibe, right? Like they're either like thinking, I want something to entertain me, or they're looking for something that can keep them busy and like getting ready for the day, maybe engage some ideas on the way to work. And so think about like how your podcast fits into people's lives. And so people, if you're not having a show for 3 months, they're going to fill the time with someone else. And so the idea is you need to be able to re-engage those listeners, for instance, on social media, give them a place to go, whether that's on social or your email, but a place to remind them. And then again, calls to action. At the end of the episode, at the end of the season, you need to tell them, hey, this is when I'm going to be back. So people know that by that time, through following you on social media or on your email, they will be like, okay, yeah, like September is when Anna will be back, which by the way, that is when I will be back launching season 4. So those are really key ways to avoid that idea of, oh, I'm not going to be able to get those listeners back. So another misconception is if you stop releasing content, podcast platforms and YouTube will show your content to less people. It kind of depends on the platform. For sure, Apple Podcasts then does not do that. But for instance, Spotify, depending if you're sharing on video content, it may hinder a little bit of your discoverability. It's not that it's not going to show it to your current listeners, but to new listeners. And so there's always different ways to get new listeners on your content, which I will talk about a little bit later. But you definitely need to think about is that really relevant to what you want to do? Like, do you really care that YouTube is showing your content to new listeners if you're working on, for instance, like growing your email list and getting people to sign up to your email list? So think about that. And so the question that I get is, how do I engage listeners? And I want to remind you that you can always create closed or open groups, communities. So for instance, like Slack, Circle, Discord, Facebook, or LinkedIn groups. Those are great ways to get your audience connected there. It can be paid, it can be free. It just depends what's the purpose of keeping these people there. Do one, do it well. That's what I always say. So don't go and spread yourself too thin. Focus on one or two platforms that work very well, ideally not bought for the same, by the same media group or company, because you never know what may happen. All right, so let's start with social media. This is the most common one for people to engage with their audiences. So you can straight up do reposts of old content based on a specific theme, on related topics, and you can also breathe new life into episodes that underperformed due to a change in the algorithm or like current events. So think about like, what can you create that is maybe like a curated selection of old content that you can push to new and current audiences. Remind them, hey, like, can you go listen? Like, how many times have you listened to a podcast episode and then, maybe 3 months down the line, for whatever reason, you were listening to it again and you're like, oh my gosh, like I forgot this thing about the episode. So you're not boring people to promote the podcast again. Another way is to expand on episodes content by adding unique new thoughts or updated information. So that is obviously an example would be if you have new updated content about like listener habits or industry related things, right? You can go in and create, just basically replace a graphic and say, hey, this is new, but if you want to look at something else that I discussed on the episode that is still relevant, go and listen. You can also add information that you forgot mentioning on the episode. How many of us end the episode and think immediately, oh shoot, I forgot this thing, right? And so you can go and expand on that and just say, hey, for everything else, go to the episode. You can also use new information from your guest that your guest shared. This can be sometimes clips, right? If your guest, for instance, like released 2 books by now, and then you talked about the first book on the episode, you can go, hey, my guest has a new book, super excited. You should actually check the episode that was where you talked about something really interesting for your listeners. So things that kind of add a little bit of like pizzazz, like something different that they can consume, but it's not necessarily reinventing the wheel for the whole content strategy. Also, collaborations, posts that you can do with a creator is just basically recycling that same information and add to call to action, hey, listen to that episode. You can do a Q&A with your listeners, a live video through like a series of posts. For business owners, most content that you get asked all the time and that people keep asking you, like, I already created a series, release a series, right? You can also bring in former guests of the show and interview them live on social media or YouTube. So expand on things that you covered on the podcast episode and just say always, hey, we did the first part, super interesting. You should go and check it out on podcast platforms. Another way to do it on social media is to keep the same information, but deliver it in a different format. So if you did a video, do a static post. If you did an infographic, do it a carousel post broken down in different information. You can do a green screen, a video, or you overlaid over a previous post, and you can reply to a comment made on an old post that promoted that episode. Now, moving into newsletters, you can send an email sequence that promotes the old episodes based on a specific theme, related topics, and breathe new life into episodes that underperformed for whatever reasons. These are so easy to create, like I really like, because you can simply resend on an email and you need to change 0 about it, right? You can also reword some copy and refresh the design if it didn't match your new branding. And it's, again, if you're just replacing like a header or like a hero image, how quick is to do that? And then you expand with new information or context if you like. So for instance, if there's like a new report that there's new data, you can reuse it. It requires minimum energy. And you never know what people may say about old content. Also, another way to do it on newsletters is to create a new section that says like related episodes, or if you like that, you may like this one too, or listen to these like inspirational guests, whatever it is. If your guest has been in the news, perfect. So I want you to think about how all of these different ways you can use to promote your podcast on closed communities or open communities. You can go back and again, list all of these reasons that I just gave you and do the same thing. So you can go, hey, a few people have asked me in the last 24 hours about these one thing. So here's an episode that I think you should listen. It's so simple. Copy, paste, give people context, off we go. And then last but not least, I want you to think about like how we engage new listeners in different ways that are beyond social media. So you can update your episode pages on your website. Those can lead to new listeners because Google really likes when pages are updated with new information. That's actually something that Amy Cox did on our episode about SEO for podcasters, which I will include the link in the show notes so you can go and listen. It was such a good episode. You can also get your content on YouTube if you haven't yet. I've been talking about on the previous episode, which I will link as well, on why it's important to keep your content on YouTube to get new listeners. You can cut short clips from old episodes, which is actually a strategy that I'm going to be doing for these in-between seasons. I'm going to continue promoting the podcast on social media and on YouTube, old episodes. And then you can also do a newsletter swap. You can do multiple newsletter swaps from fellow content creators, business owners, but also there are newsletters, which I can't recall the name one. I think it's the Earbuds Collective from Ariel Nisselblatt. And then what's another one that I do have here? Oh, Good Pods. You can also submit your podcast to Spotify and Apple Podcasts and get new listeners that way. So newsletter swaps or podcast platforms that accept submissions, those are great ways to get in front of new listeners. Spend that time doing it. You can also take that time to collaborate with other creators. I have a partnership with Portuguese podcast platform podcaststrategist. We do collaborations, and then I have episodes that I have created that have expanded that topic, but they're in English. But again, this is another way to get new listeners because I know Portuguese listeners most of them speak English, so they consume the podcast as well. You can also start an RSS digest feed that takes listeners through episode 1 all the way to episode where you are. And you say, hey, once people subscribe to this newsletter, they will receive an email every day or every week about my podcast. So that is one of the ways that I actually show you how to grow a podcast using newsletters. I have created a guide. It teaches about the 5 easy formats that you can replicate to start sending newsletters. I'll have the link below. And it's so easy to set up. And you will see results. You will get listener engagement. You will see an increase in downloads. So I definitely recommend. I'll put the link in below. So we covered in these podcast episodes so many different ways that you can grow your podcast, whether that's through social media, through newsletters, or through Google and revamping all pages. I hope this was helpful. Actually, I know it was. So let me know what was your favorite idea, what you're going to be implementing. I always reply to you, whether that's on LinkedIn or Instagram or via email. So you can use one of those 3 formats. And I'm going to say, if you want to stay in touch, follow me on Instagram. I'm at the podcast space. I'll have the links below. And you'll hear from me. I have such great content coming up in the summer, in between seasons. I will be back in September of 2025 with a new season. I'm going to start writing my book. So that's one of the reasons why I need to stop the podcast too. So for all of that and get inspiration, follow me on the podcast space on Instagram. And if you could, I'm going to add so many calls to action on this episode, but if you could recommend this podcast to a friend, it would mean the world. If you have recommended to a friend already, please rate and review the podcast so that more people look at this podcast as a reliable way to grow their show as well. So I would be so, so grateful. All right. Until then, until September of 2025, keep creating imperfect content that moves you forward. I'll see you then.